This will be session number 8. We're asking the question here, did Jesus actually exist? Essentially, the existence of Jesus has lately become a hotly debated issue, especially across the atheist internet. Increasingly, skeptics are arguing that the Catholic Church simply invented the Christian religion whole cloth. So, was the Roman Empire, specifically as it is sometimes alleged under Constantine, truly responsible for gendering Jesus? Well, in this particular session, we're going to be answering some of the questions surrounding these issues and presenting a case that will allow us to see that the existence of Jesus historically is simply an unavoidable issue. So let's begin. In his influential book, Cur Deus Homo, medieval Christian thinker Saint Anselm recorded the following. Give it a listen. Quote, "The God-man himself originates the New Testament. And as we must acknowledge him to be true, so no one can dissent from anything contained in these books." End quote. Well, the now historic treatise, which was written in the 11th century, sought to answer the question of why God became a man. The monumental work singularly opened a fresh new chapter in Christian thought on Christ's atonement. Drawing from the tools of logical reasoning, Anselm persuasively argued that the Scriptures may be trusted, showing that so long as the incarnation was quote-unquote necessary, the Old and New Testaments were inescapably true. Quoting from the volume, one alleged critic commented, quote, "All things you have said seem to me reasonable and incontrovertible. And by the solution of the single question you have proposed, do I see the truth of all that is contained in the Old and New Testaments." He then admitted, "You convince both Jews and pagans by the mere force of reason alone." In this way, St. Anselm sought to demonstrate that the full content of Scripture was doubtlessly conclusive. While Anselm's iconic argument was influential in his own day, indeed, few gospel spokesmen had authored such an intrepid case. But with the dawn of the present era, new arguments have arisen against Jesus, with some modern dissenters holding that Jesus never even existed. Hence, former president of the national organization American Atheists, Frank Zindler, popularly claimed that Jesus was a myth. And world-renowned atheist Richard Dawkins has also stated, quote, "A serious case can be made that Jesus never lived at all." Jesus never lived at all. And so what then are Christians to think of these sorts of assertions? Are these kinds of statements truly rooted in fact? Or is it possible that the church's one foundation is truly situated on little else but the babblings of a few credulous, albeit well-meaning, fishermen? Well, for most Bible believers, the existence of Jesus is settled historically from the Scriptures. Sadly, most objectors today argue that further proof is needed, a move which for the biblically persuaded would be categorically verboten. Well, some time ago, I was challenged with these issues. One simply cannot avoid them in the work of modern evangelism. I had recently uploaded a video to our ministry's YouTube channel and had begun to turn my attention to other important ministry duties. And within the space of about an hour, an impressive list of questions were delivered by atheists, all responding to my posts. Judging from the comments, it appeared that most of my viewers seemed to regard the gospel texts as loosely speaking, historical. Give it a listen. Quote, "No purported history confirming miracles can be trusted," one person commented. "Stories about magic are the work of whim and fancy." Another one said, "We should no more believe in the existence of unicorns than in the existence of a man of such rare and miraculous abilities." Others sternly argued that the history of Jesus is entirely comprised of religious propaganda. Together, all held that the Gospels falsely claim to be independently written and are therefore unobjective. Well, reading through the comments, I, of course, immediately understood them. because these sorts of grievances are actually very common in our culture. Perhaps you've encountered them. Owing largely to the rise of modern anti-supernaturalism, society has slowly come to treat the Gospels as fable. Additionally, further doubt has surfaced regarding the fuller scope of Scripture history itself, a development which has led some scholars to conjecture that the edifice of the Christian faith is now once again collapsing. And so, assessing the various charges, I fashioned my reply. I sought to provide an answer showing the reason for my internal reposal. For the deeper problem behind these sorts of confused allegations is that the notion that Jesus never existed literally has no antecedent. As noted atheist Bible scholar Bart Ehrman has written, quote, "The idea that Jesus did not exist is a modern notion. It has no ancient precedents. It was made up. One might well call it a modern myth, the myth of the mythical Jesus." End quote. Yes.
I got 18th century.
Oh, pardon me. Yes, it was made up in the 18th century. Correct. Somebody's following along in their session guides. Thank you.
Someone has to.
Someone has to, yes. Well, knowing this to be true, I busily set myself to typing. I offered my defense for the historical Jesus. Because when it comes to assessing various anti-Christian charges, few other claims today manage to appear so plainly mistaken. Again, Bart Ehrman writes, quote, "Not even those who attacked Christianity ever entertained the thought that he did not exist." What then of the plethora of comments which lay before me today? It appeared that my objectors were simply ill-informed of their own position. And so I therefore began to frame my argument by pointing to our principal sources to the life of Jesus. And that would be the surviving gospel texts and the written traditions behind them. The surviving gospel texts and the written traditions behind them. Because if Jesus never existed, as some authors today claim, how is it that we seem to know so much about him? Indeed, the independent character of our biblical histories would be one of the clearest strikes against these sorts of modern proposals. Those who argue otherwise have only succeeded in becoming helpless to account for the curious and synonymous rise of our biblical sources. Unfortunately, skeptics often fail to properly acknowledge this point. Many have chosen to favor a more conspiratorial explanation. And so, declining to admit that our biblical sources are independent, many now argue that the gospel writers merely colluded. Hence, the idea here is that Luke drew from Matthew while Matthew copied from Mark. John then later drafted his gospel inspirited by their traditions. And so in this way, it is contended that Mark is our only source to the life of Jesus, leaving us with but a single unaided witness to Jesus' existence. The question is, do such theories truly explain away the biblical evidence? Is the existence of Jesus as debatable as all of that? Well, skeptics who answer yes have essentially contended that Mark is the sole begetter of the, quote, Christ myth fable. On this account, the Christian faith, in fact, is effectively plundered and virtually robbed of its historical significance. The truth of the matter, however, is that the biblical evidence shows that our four gospel authors were, in fact, independent from one another. What does that mean? Well, to illustrate this point, take our account of Easter morning. Precisely how many women visited the garden on that day? Well, the Gospel of Luke specifically mentions 3 women, along with a larger group who apparently also went. And yet, oddly enough, the Gospel of John adversely reports, quote, "On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came." End quote. The text then mentions that after seeing the empty tomb, she alone ran and told the other disciples that Jesus was missing. And so the question thus arises, how many women were there? Precisely who was it that visited the garden that day? Well, the skeptic would do well to acknowledge that the answer would apparently depend on which gospel we happen to be reading. Thus, according to the Gospel of Luke, the greater number is undisclosed, while in the Gospel of John, only Mary Magdalene is named. It would therefore appear that our Gospels differ on the number of women in the garden who were witness to Jesus that day. Now, I think this point alone would be a strike against collusion theories, because if John and Luke conspired, why isn't the number of women the same? In fact, atheist scholars, the likes of Bart Ehrman, have readily admitted that this is a sign of literary independence. Hence, Luke and John are clearly recalling the same historical event while also telling the story in markedly different ways. And so it cannot therefore be that Mark is our only source to the life of Jesus. The other writers as well authored independent histories. Can we see the argument that's being made here clearly enough? Well, sadly, in response, my critics were largely unaccepting of this point. Many attempted to argue for alternative reasons for doubt. Examples, such as the Gospels often reorder key events, were thrown out as reasonable grounds for unbelief. Hey, one Gospel says that the order of the events was this, and the other Gospel says something different. Therefore, they're both false. But you see, varying descriptions of the same historical event or events do not necessarily show that a given account is unreliable. In fact, such discrepancies could serve to prove the opposite point, namely that the gospel sources are drawing from the same traditions. Looking again to Luke's gospel, we find this very point illumined. Mary Magdalene arrived to where the disciples were fearfully hiding. John records her words, quote, "They have taken the Lord, and we do not know where they have laid him." John 20 and verse 2. Now here we see that John appeared to know that Mary Magdalene was not alone in the garden on that day. Notice the phrase, "we do not know." Obviously, Mary wasn't alone, and John seems to be aware of that fact. For he recalls her greeting with the telling phrase, "we do not know." And so it would seem that Luke and John were thus at least minimally in touch with the very same tradition. Thus, even though they described the events in different ways, nevertheless, they were aware of the essential historical core. And so in light of these various issues, Professor Bart Ehrman concludes, quote, "And so it is quite wrong to argue that Mark is our only independent witness. The other gospel accounts are completely or partially independent from one another as well." He therefore emphasizes, quote, "I have repeatedly stressed that a tradition appearing in multiple independent sources has a greater likelihood of being historical." And so it would thus appear that this common skeptic charge is henceforth baseless. Now what's important to note here is that Ehrman himself is an atheist. That's a very illuminating point. And so I therefore pressed my atheist viewers that day to consider this fact. I sought to advocate that day for a more conservative position. For the fact that the four Gospels often narrate the same stories does not negate the truth of their literary independence. Nor would it be the case that it is impossible to distinguish sources that collude from those that merely share the same historical tradition. The Gospels therefore seem to corroborate Jesus' story, the four Gospels, a point which at the very least would surely prove that Jesus existed. Finally, let's consider various untutored assertions to the contrary. For example, Richard Dawkins' claim that Jesus never existed. Here, the world's, quote, most famous atheist cites Professor G.A. Wells for supposedly debunking Jesus' existence. Unfortunately, two problems loom behind this sort of a claim, which make it wholly impossible for us to trust it. In fact, one of the problems would appear to flatly demonstrate that the, quote, Christ myth argument is simply steeped in misinformation. Hence, the first major problem would be that Wells' views have simply been misstated. That is, Professor G.A. Wells simply no longer holds to his previously held position. For reasons that we are now only free to speculate upon, Dawkins has, perhaps deliberately, cited long outdated information. Returning to Bart Ehrman, the atheist scholar confirms that Professor G.A. Wells has now admitted to Jesus' existence. That's very interesting. Consequently, Wells himself would probably disagree with Dawkins' citation. So much for tall claims to proof of Jesus' non-existence. Secondarily, however, and perhaps more pertinently, Wells is no authority on the subject of ancient history. His comments are rather delivered in this case as a European professor in German linguistics out of Birkbeck University. Thus, his one-time claim to Jesus' non-existence was in all likelihood simply due to professional inexperience with the data. Since the late 1990s, however, Wells has corrected his views. He no longer holds to a, quote, mythical Jesus position. For this reason, Professor Bart Ehrman rightly concludes that atheist claims like these should be relegated to the cottage industry. For he writes, quote, "We are talking about a large number of sources dispersed over a remarkably broad geographic expanse." He therefore ends by questioning, on the basis of this evidence alone, it is hard to understand how Jesus could have been invented. Invented by whom? Where? When? How then could there be so many independent strands of evidence? And so I think in conclusion, at least with regard to the biblical evidence for Jesus' existence, that we can believe boldly in the claim that Jesus Christ existed, ironically, simply because the, quote, Bible tells it so. Really, no further reason is ultimately necessary. There is no further reason that's necessary here, since the existence of Jesus is so plentifully attested. Thus, the four biblical Gospels, unaided by further proofs, are completely adequate to settle this nagging question. The only remaining question is, will our atheist friends at long last decisively come to grips with Jesus' existence? I think that really is the bottom line. But with that said, I think it truly is important for us to understand that the gospel records are not the only source to the life of Jesus. In fact, there are other ancient historical sources. One of them actually shows up under the pen of someone named Tacitus. According to tradition, the ancient Roman historian Tacitus spoke directly of the existence of Jesus, and born in the year 56 AD, 4 years after Christianity began to spread into the continent of India, incidentally, he lived within the same general time period as Jesus Christ himself. And so he therefore grew up hearing about Jesus and would have been alive to witness the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD. He also happened to be witness to the great persecution of the Christian church, which broke out sometime around 64 AD. The story goes something like this. Following Emperor Nero's setting of the city of Rome on fire, the bloodthirsty emperor later blamed the crime on the Christians. The story here is that he wanted to extend the pavilion of his palace out over the hill Palatine. The problem is that on the backside of the hill, there was all these large dwellings of fairly rich persons and rich and important persons in Rome. And so what Nero did was he set his capital city on fire and then blamed the crime on the Christians. He then proceeded to carry out a bloody execution of many devoted followers of Jesus, quoting from what scholar Ronald Meller calls Tacitus's crowning achievement. This prominent Roman historian and senator scribed the following riveting words. Give this a listen. Quote, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus," that's very interesting, that is a Latinization, evidently, of the term, "from whom the name had its origin," listen to this, "suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius," that's very compelling, "at the hands of one of our procurators, guess who? Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." End quote. You can see his hatred of culture as it stood at the time. But what is perhaps most fascinating, most revealing about Tacitus's words is that they lucidly show the truth that even Jesus' own opponents in his lifetime spoke of his having existed. And so therefore, since Christ's enemies did not attempt to declare that he never existed, on what grounds, as we noted earlier, do scholars today try to issue this same sort of questionable claim? And by the way, scholars is, I use the term extremely loosely because most of them just are not very scholarly. But continuing on, proof of Jesus' existence is further seen within the work of another noted first century Roman historian named Suetonius. We find his mention of Jesus in his famous work, Lives of the 12 Caesars. Born in the year 69 AD, Suetonius cites an event which is generally noted as the expulsion of the Jews. And in Divus Claudius 25 of his work, we read Suetonius' compelling words, "The Jews constantly make disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus." This would be with an E, not an I. Why the misspelling? It's commonly conjectured, even by some atheists, that this would just simply be a scholarly misspelling. That's what this would be. So it's probably supposed to be Christus with an I instead of an E. Suetonius then concludes with the comments that the Jews were, quote, expelled from Rome. Now what's interesting is that this historical event is said to have taken place under the reign of Emperor Claudius, roughly 49 AD. That's still within the time period of the biblical writers. It's further corroborated, therefore, in the New Testament book of Acts, that is the expulsion of the Jews. There, Luke, who is commonly thought to be the author of Acts, wrote the following careful commentary. Give it a listen. Acts 18, verses 1 and 2. After Paul left Athens, he went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Finally, this will be the last one that we mention, we have the writing of noted Jewish historian Josephus Flavius. So if you ever want to name your child, there's a great name. Historians regard him as being born in the year 37 AD, and thus an important contemporary to the early Christian movement. And Josephus himself claimed to have been a personal eyewitness to the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans. This man was actually a temple Pharisee. So he would have been around, and he had become a soldier and was part of the armed resistance against Rome for some years. He fought against Rome as a Jewish soldier, and he too wrote of Jesus' existence in the following account. Give it a listen. Quote, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles." End quote. Josephus then concludes his comments in noting Jesus' crucifixion along with his alleged resurrection, leaving it almost beyond question that Jesus Christ in fact existed. What does this all mean? Any hope of somehow erasing Jesus' memory from public recollection faces the challenge of having to rewrite the history of Western civilization.